There's something you're saying in the book as to what African spirituality is holistic. It's communitarian, and it's not
contemplative
and
contemplative.
Joyful.
Could you I always add
elaborate?
Activist. Yeah.
An activist. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure.
Please?
Joyful, of course, means that, for one thing, our spirituality is usually expressed in music, in dance, in happiness. You know, there are those, especially in African Americans, but also I would say in Africa, there is that music which is sorrowful, laments and dirges and things like that. But there is always some source of some form of joy expressed at the same time. The joy of being together as family, as sharing the same experiences, as being a whole instead of just an individual, which is something that is just not African, to live as an individual as opposed to a community. And that leads, of course, to the communitarian, because I love the saying, I am because we are, which is an African saying, but it applies to African Americans. We see ourselves as a family. That, sadly, has been changing, say, in the last 50 years, ironically, since the success of the civil rights movement. But there is still that sense of community, that sense of togetherness that enabled them to survive all of those 400 plus years of slavery. Contemplative, again, we are a meditative people. That's how we develop our music, through our interaction with God, through prayer, through sermon or preaching, quiet moments when we let ourselves go and let God take charge of our lives. So that would be the contemplative. And what was the last one?
Holistic?
Holistic. Well, of course, that's the understanding that all of the world is charged with God. We are not a people who separate the sacred from the secular. We don't wait till Sunday to celebrate, to pray, to worship. It's every day of the week. God is as much a part of our lives, of our everyday lives, as for other people. Western society, for example, where, okay, you go to church on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, and that's where you pray, that's where you listen to a sermon, but the rest of the week you just do whatever you want. No, God is a part of us, is with us, and is in all things that surround us all the time.
And how do you compare the contemplative part of it as over against what we know as of for Hinduism or Buddhism, for example? You have somebody sitting and just totally silent in a state of meditation. Is there any parallelism?
Oh, sure. There are, I guess you could say there well, I mean, obviously there are African Buddhists, but there are African Christians. Remember, it was Africans who founded the whole monastic tradition. Who was it? Just let me think of it for a minute. I can't remember his name. It was something the Black. That's what I remember. Saint, I can't remember his name. I'm sorry. But he was the founder of the monastic system, a reformed thief and allegedly murderer, who went out into the desert and became so famous for his holiness, that people started to come and live with him. And so that whole sense, many people think, well, African peoples aren't, because we're joyful and like to dance and sing, and that we're not contemplative. But that is very much a part of our heritage. And in the sense that I would not say it's different. It's a different expression, perhaps, of contemplation and meditation than Buddhist, or even because Muslims meditate. All forms of religion have meditative aspects to them. And so, in that sense, we as African peoples are no different from followers of any other faith. It's just a part of our, there are times when you set apart to be alone with God. Again, I think the difference is that we don't really see it as something separate.
Absolutely.
From what we're doing on a daily basis. There's just that time when you stop and you are at one with God, and then you move on. We don't have, okay, 2 o'clock is the time for meditation, anything like that.
And in that regard, you were saying somewhere in the book that you describe Christianity as being dualistic. That reminded me of a book that I read a couple of years ago. It's written by Ellen Pagel, I guess. She's
Oh yes, Elaine
Harvard-
Pagel.
Ellen Pagel.
Yeah.
And the title is The Origin of Satan.
Yes.
And I wondered, what is the place of the entity known as Satan in the African spirituality?
Well, I think in African spirituality, certainly, you have, the lesser gods or the intermediaries. And historically, I believe, and I have to admit, I don't know as much as I should know about African traditional religions, but there was always a place for, I guess you would say, the other side of God, the negative side of God, which would be found in some of these entities who, instead of bringing peace, bringing happiness, bringing love, would try and sow disarray and chaos and things like that. So it's certainly there. The difference, of course, I think with African religions especially is the whole different understanding of sin from Christianity, whereas sin is not something that is personal for Africans. It's something that is imposed upon you, in a sense, something negative. Whereas in Christianity, again, when I say it's dualistic, that's historically. Initially it was not, I would say under Jesus, but over the years it has become increasingly a greater emphasis on the sacred, which was seen as something other than your ordinary life, your ordinary person, so that a person, well, I'll give you an example. When initially blacks were brought to the United States, what is now, the United States, they were plantation owners, Protestants. Plantation owners were afraid to baptize them and Christianize them because it had always been taught that you could not enslave a fellow Christian. So I think it was the Anglican Bishop of London very conveniently said, baptism provides only a spiritual rather than a physical freedom. Well, in the black understanding and the African understanding, that's just impossible. You can't have a separate spiritual experience from your bodily experience. But for them, they saw no problem with that. So your soul was free inside a body that was still in prison as a slave. Even now today, it makes no sense to me. Absolutely. But it made a great deal of sense to them, and then that's how they proceeded, so that by doing that separation, you could do things to that body that we would say were horrific, the beatings, the mutilations, and things like that. But that body was part of the secular world, so it was partly evil, if not totally evil, as long as you did not damage the soul. And I call it a schizophrenia. I really do, because I just cannot wrap my mind. I've tried for many years now to wrap my mind around that.
It's nonsense.
And it's impossible.
Yes.
But it's still being done today. It's still being done today.